Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. Pastor Benjamin Creamer said, "When you worship power, compassion and mercy will look like sins." This idea was echoed when Marion Budde, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., said the following to President Trump during a national prayer service.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now.
Following her sermon, Trump condemned her words and was followed by his administration making false accusations against a Lutheran organization, Global Refuge, and Catholic Charities. Despite figures like Franklin Graham and Cardinal Timothy Dolan claiming that Trump is a devout Christian, his actions often seem to suggest an antagonism toward mainline denominations. Could Trump's actions be an attempt to discredit these religious traditions while lifting up Christian nationalism? That issue is next. My guest today is the Reverend Peter Cook, Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches, a coalition of over 7,000 congregations throughout the state of New York. Reverend Cook, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
One of the things I want to ask you, which is why I want you on the show today, in the issue of religion during the Trump administration, do you think that given his recent actions that this administration is taking an anti-mainline denominational stance?
I think you could say that, but I think it's broader than that. I think he's taking what I would call an anti-Jesus stance, and really embracing Christian nationalism, which really has very little to do with Christianity, whether that's in the mainline church or in all other kinds of Christian expression, including our evangelical and Pentecostal friends. Baptists, of all stripes had their beginnings because they were persecuted by the government and they really valued their freedom, and they really struggled with the idea of Christian nationalism. So really, I think the president, in forming this anti-Christian bias task force, and I assume that all kind of comes under his faith-based office, really, I think, is embracing Christian nationalism, by which we mean a government adopts a religion, twists that religion, and then weaponizes it against other people, including other Christians. And I think that's exactly what's going on here.
I'd ask that question because in light,
So
obviously, of the sermon by Bishop Budde, for example, and then that was followed up
yeah,
with the attacks against the Lutheran Church, Global Refuge. And then you have Vice President Vance going against Catholic Charities and saying some of the things he has said. And the reaction to, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, by people like Mike Collins of Georgia, who said he wants to deport the bishop.
right.
So some of these things, quite frankly, I mean, it's laughable if
Yeah,
it wasn't for the fact that he's an elected official. So I raise it out of that context because, as you
right.
just said, the White House initiative
Mm.
is being headed by a televangelist, namely Paula White. So, which is why I asked that question. Is he trying to
Right.
usurp the primacy of mainline denominations with what I would agree would be Christian nationalism?
Well, again, I do think he is trying very much to usurp the voice of the mainline church, insofar as we are strong proponents of following Jesus, to welcome the stranger, to um, say that every person is created in the image of God, that we as Christians are called to be stewards of the earth. Certainly, when it comes to immigration policy, which is part of the subject of this lawsuit, we have as a central religious practice, and I don't care what denomination you're a part of, to welcome the stranger and to extend a bold hospitality to them. Maybe what Bishop Buddy did was to give voice to those values, but those aren't just values of the mainline Christian churches. Those are values of churches of just about every, theological stripe that I can think of. What's happened here by the Trump administration is that they have really taken these venerable traditions and distorted them and twisted them in such a way that they just become unrecognizable.
And following up on that, you also have a lawsuit that you have filed against Department of Homeland Security because it gives ICE the authority to enter into houses of worship to make arrests. Could you
Mhm.
say more about that lawsuit and what do you think the ultimate result is going to be from that?
The New York State Council of Churches is one of 27 plaintiffs from around the country, including four other councils of churches: Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, which have been party to this lawsuit through Georgetown Law School. And we really got into this because we are extremely concerned about our ability to welcome the stranger into our midst and offer our churches as a safe sanctuary where people can worship and where we can freely serve others. And this directive from the Trump administration is really a rescission of what was a sensitive location memo, which gave some pretty specific guidelines to ICE how they should approach a church. And all of those guidelines were pretty much thrown out by the Trump administration. And it's very vague when they talk about ICE officers should use, quote, common sense. And we're also concerned that how, they say that they're going after, illegal immigrants, but they really have a very broad definition as to what that is. I mean, it could be that you're picking up people who are not illegal, done anything illegal at all. They might have a civil violation or something like that. But it can also mean that, ICE is not even terribly discerning about that. So when ICE makes this threat, it can really have an impact on people coming to worship, which can result in reduction in our worship attendance. It could prevent people from accessing food pantries, for instance, or legal services, or any other number of things which the church is able to provide.
Which has already started to happen. I know there was an opinion piece in today's Washington Post that's talking about that,
Mhm.
how many people are staying away because of fear of ICE coming into the sanctuary to make arrests. That is sending a chill throughout congregational life. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you is looking at it in even maybe a broader sense, although it's tied with immigration, is part of this what some would call a adhering to the replacement theory that a lot of people attributed to President Trump in his first administration. For example, Vivek Ramaswamy has been let go from Doge because he suggested that they should be bringing Indian immigrants into the country, and he was let go. You also saw President Trump say that he's going to cut off aid to South Africa because he does not like how white Afrikaners were being treated, and he wanted to bring
Right,
white Afrikaners to the United States. But is this in some way,
right.
this is race based also, which a lot of people have been saying for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trump campaign was deeply vested in the idea of replacement theory. And the idea behind replacement theory, of course, is that there are people of color and immigrants who, if there are too many of them, could dislodge white power, and do that through an election. So the goal here is to try to replace them with white people, secure your particular vision of Christianity, which is very male-centered, very hierarchical, very patriarchal, and is highly intolerant of anyone who might veer from a very narrow definition of the nuclear family. And we just think that that is a sin, and we've said so, long before this Trump administration has come into power. We did a tour on Christian nationalism the week before the election. We went to places like Springfield, Ohio, and all across New York. And one of the things we really featured in this Christian nationalist discussion was the use of replacement theory in the election and how candidates were embracing that theory to push their point. We saw some of the most virulent anti-immigrant language that I think I could possibly imagine. And coupled with that was a lot of anti-trans language that was getting used. And they would sometimes pit people of color against trans people as a way to drive a wedge. But it's all part of this whole agenda to replace people that they see as deviating from a white power structure, which also happens to be quite patriarchal and sexist and homophobic in its orientation.
Well, let me ask you this. Part of the role of the religious community is not only to talk truth to power, as Bishop Buddy did, but also to create kind of a moral compass for the population. And
Mhm.
so part of the issue has to be how do you get public opinion to also begin to shift? There is a large segment of the population, as you just noted, that is in favor of what President Trump is trying to do. So, how does the church community, religious community, begin to persuade people to shift their thinking about this?
One of the things that the council has started is something called the Religious Nationalisms Project. We really began the Religious Nationalisms Project because we were really concerned about how people in the church can get really taken in with this by this political rhetoric and really forget who they are as practicing Christians or Buddhists or Muslims or Jewish people or Hindus, and really focusing on the affirmations of what we're about and using that as a critique of the government. So this is the beginning of a 4-year process that we hope to bring all across the country to really highlight the scourge of religious nationalism. The National Council of Churches has published two really remarkable statements on religious nationalisms and also Hindu nationalism, which we are also going to be doing a lot more to promote in these coming months and years. We fought really hard for the National Council of Churches to take a position on this because up to this point, that conversation was either relegated to a secular audience or to much more conservative Christian nationalist kinds of folks, or Hindu nationalists, by the way. So we're trying to give people the tools of how we can identify how this nationalism works and act in the public square accordingly.
Several years ago, you and a number of colleagues were made to leave India because of religious nationalism. So you understand
Yeah.
it from a personal perspective. Here in the United States, for example, if you looked at the inauguration of the president, you had to be a little troubled by, let's say, a Franklin Graham giving, prayer. This is a guy who said that Muslims should be banned from the United States. So, and
Mhm.
this is before Trump even put in his first Muslim ban. So it seems that the folks who get the most press, the most publicity, are the ones who seem to be against anti-religion. I understand that he's Christian and he's pushing Christianity, and that's fine. But let's be realistic. There's a lot of folks out there right now, which is why I asked you about the president's faith-based initiative being headed by someone who, quite frankly, may be a little skeptical when it comes to theology, for example. She is a follower of the Seven Mountains Mandate and Dominionism and all of that.
Right.
So, how does an organization like the New York State Council of Churches confront that? I know you have the program that you talk about, but how do you really begin to confront that
Um,
type of theology that's out there?
If you want to talk about dominionism, one of their goals is to try to dominate the media and the church as one of it's two of the seven mountains, right? And they've put an extraordinary amount of money and time and organizing into trying to gain control of those entities and also engage in a lot of press censorship. I mean, we certainly see this in India with basically reporters getting fired or being physically threatened in the United States. There is a lot of corporate power which can suppress these, authentic religious voices. And Paula White, who's really a proponent of the rather sinful prosperity gospel, is completely tied into money, where she's like blessing or praying over stock transfers, for instance, or hedge funds or this kind of thing. But the church, since its inception, has always been on a collision course in its best sense with, dominant powers to be, whether that, be Constantine in the third century or Christian nationalism right now.
What is the council advising its member congregations and denominational heads to do in the face of ICE raids? In the opinion piece in the Washington Post, There were some pastors who said they're just simply locking their doors during service. So, what are you telling folks or advising people to do? Are you suggesting a sort of civil disobedience? How are you going to handle that?
So let me just say that all of our denominational partners and a lot of our secular partners are all wrestling with that question about what to offer in terms of guidance to, their respective institutions. And part of it is we're honestly still trying to figure all of that out. There's a lot of unknowns, but I think at our basic core, to have everybody in the congregation be familiar with know your rights about what ICE is allowed and not allowed to do. Showing up at your church with a warrant that's not signed by a judge, for instance, is, really a basis to not invite them into your space. I think it's self-defeating to lock your doors. I think it's better to maybe up your hospitality game of really encouraging people in your church to know each other better, just, and also how to be aware of who's coming in and how to greet people. I mean, good sort of basic hospitality and evangelism. But all of us are trying to work on guidance as we go here of helping churches as best we can stay true to their mission of being hospitable to the stranger. And locking your doors is really a counterproductive exercise on a whole bunch of fronts.
We all know of the reports that talk about the decline of the mainline church, particularly in terms of attendance and membership. With that in mind, does the church or religious institutions in general have the capacity to hold an administration such as this accountable beyond the court system?
Well, let me just say that church decline and people looking at that question is kind of a cottage industry that has been with us for 40 years. I think that the church from its inception is constantly dying and rising, in every historical period, and I don't think it's any different now. We've always operate in a, a minority position, in a position where things don't look good. There's always a story of decline. There's all kinds of people out there trying to tell you that, you're not relevant and put a lot of money behind telling you that. But I kind of like Mark Twain's quip that the news of my death is greatly exaggerated. And so, I've served a small church, and that small church worked in a scrappy, nimble kind of way. And we built a 22 unit housing development for seniors and people of disabilities. And they were able to do that because they were just really on fire and committed to trying to do the right thing. And I've also been the pastor of two much larger congregations, which frankly had more resources, but get so kind of caught up in trying to maintain the institution that they really lose their verve or ability to be able to speak out when they really should. So I just think there's always pressures on churches, great, large, and small, to say, hey, you don't have the capacity to do this, and that this is beyond what you can do. And I just think if we remain true to the resurrection, we really can stand up against that.
And I think a lot of people would agree with you. If you look at the civil rights movement, which was really not as large a movement as people like to pretend that it was. Basically regional,
Yeah.
but it made a huge change in the culture of the United States. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for the church and the religious community in general to combat this and to make a great change. The last question I want to ask you, how do you handle you as a theologian and as a pastor when you begin to try to create a narrative around the personage of a person in power, that they are what the Bible gives us, King Cyrus? How do
Right.
you deal with that?
Well, I I think that President Trump has been referred to as kind of a King Cyrus sort of figure, and I really appreciate that very intriguing question. It's interesting to me that on the one hand, we have people like Franklin Graham and others, going around telling us that Trump is really a very devout person, a very devout Christian. And on the other hand, holding up King Cyrus, who by most accounts was not very devout religiously, and yet somehow managed to, be an instrument to help, build up Israel. I tend to have a generous view about people who call themselves devout. I think there are a lot of devout Christians out there, devout people who do some pretty nasty things to people. And so I'm not so interested in their piety. I'm interested in the fruits of their labor. And so if you are, calling yourself devout and you're issuing orders every day to try to, throw immigrants out of the country and attack gay and transgender people and attacking the environment and trying to basically defy the rule of law when it applies to you, but apply it excessively for people who commit much more minor kinds of infractions. Um, that really, I think, calls your devotion into question.
Going forward, are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, I mean, Jesus is at the center of my life, and he died on a cross and he died because of our cruelty and sin towards one another. And yet, in spite of that, he rose again and he lives now and forevermore. And we always are encountering, very difficult and dark times in our common life. But I also point to the joy and the hope that we find every day in doing ministry where we care for others. I think that the Trump administration is really engaged in something called shock and awe, where he's just trying to so overwhelm you with all these things that you hit the idea is to have you lose hope. And he does a pretty good job of that, I think. But as Christians, I think we need to focus on not everything, but pick a couple of things and give our best to it, and then turn the rest over to God. I have a colleague who has a therapist who said to him one day when he was, coming in trying to unload all of his burdens in the therapist's office, and the therapist said, you do a lot of good things and you should really be proud of it, but don't you think you should let God do some of it?
My guest today has been
So,
the Reverend Peter Cook, Executive Director for the New York State Council of Churches Reverend, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been an honor.
Great. Thank you. It's just such a pleasure, and I really appreciate your beautiful questions, and I was invigorated by this conversation. Thank you.
Join us again next week as we have another topic of interest here on the Aguilar Conversations, a Global Perspective.